Within the original Dark Souls, there are two games at odds. One is a brutal and difficult game where the player is repeatedly tested by progressive challenges. Each boss or dungeon requires the player's skill to meet a certain level, pushing them to new heights as the game progresses. This game can be frustrating, as players will repeatedly fail until their skills improve enough to conquer their current challenge, and if a particular challenge doesn't mesh well with the way a certain player approaches problem solving, then they're out of luck. However, it's also an intensely rewarding game, where the player is granted a sense of accomplishment after defeating each new challenge, and they can feel their steady growth with each triumph. The strength of this type of game comes from its narrow focus, the fact that the game attempts to do very few things and do them very well. The other type is a game where the player may choose to play however they like and in a variety of playstyles. You can be an armored knight, a powerful sorcerer, a cunning rogue, a priest of the cloth, or anything in between. You can also play with the aid of others or by yourself if you choose. And if the player encounters a wall, they can explore in another direction until they've gained enough power to break down the wall that had previously obstructed them. This freedom allows players to live out a variety of different fantasies, and also allows players of all different types to get something out of their experience, but it comes at a cost. Because there are so many playstyles and routes to the finish, it's impossible to provide a tailored experience to just one, because the more paths there are through the game, the more development time has to be split between those paths. One player may find a boss incredibly challenging to slay with their sword and shield, while another may find that its weakness to fire makes it easy prey for their fire sorcery. So while many players may be able to complete the game because their playstyle is supported, they may all come away with wildly varying experiences and subsequent views of the game that they played. This type of game contrasts with the other, in that it tries to do many things to allow the player to explore at their own will and craft their own experience. Elements of both of these ideals are present in Dark Souls 1 through 3, but if a game were to embody just one, then that game would be Sekiro. Out of all the Souls games, Sekiro is the most punishing and least accessible. Aside from a few cheese strats, each boss can only be approached in a small handful of ways. There is no alternate playstyle that will allow the player to avoid learning how to parry or redirect lightning. It's do or die, as one small mistake can often lead to instant death, and shadows only die twice. It is also the most rewarding game, as this delicate back and forth dance on the edge of a knife results in an incredible payoff when the player finally triumphs. When I felled Genichiro after dozens of attempts, there was no doubt in my mind that I had conquered a genuinely difficult challenge, and I had done it thanks to my own ability. Some came away from Sekiro thinking that while the game could be intensely rewarding, it is ultimately flawed due to how restrictive and inaccessible it is. Perhaps there is merit to the argument that a better balance could be struck between its narrow focus and broader accessibility, but it's only so rewarding because of its restrictive nature. It's only so rewarding because the game throws a wall at the player and says, "Climb this," and the player can't go around or use summons. It's rewarding because they climb the wall with their own strength. Elden Ring is FromSoft's attempt to make the other type of game, the game that is as unrestricted as possible. It has more builds, more dungeons, more secrets, more lore, more summons, more playstyles and routes through the game than ever before, and the most open map that From Software has ever constructed. It is undoubtedly FromSoft's freest game. To those that know me well, it's no secret that games based on freedom and exploration are my favorite kind. I uncovered every shrine in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and explored every nook and cranny of the Outer Wilds, leaving no quantum stone unturned. I'm also a huge fan of From Software's games, and count myself among the many who have been profoundly affected by the series. It stands to reason that Elden Ring's marriage of the Souls formula and a newfound sense of freedom and exploration would make for the perfect game for me, but as I struggled my way through the lands between, I came to a disappointing realization that these two types of games are, in some ways, fundamentally incompatible. Compromises will always have to be made between the two, and as a result, Elden Ring fails to reach the greatest heights of either. This failure can be felt throughout the game's combat systems, as many of them have been affected by the wider variety of playstyles and options. Summons have always been a point of contention for Souls games, with some claiming that beating a boss with summons isn't really beating it, that it's somehow a lesser victory. I never gave these claims much thought. Anyone is free to play the game in any way that they wish. I don't have to use summons if I don't want to. It doesn't affect my experience, so why should I care? But Elden Ring's inclusion of the summoning bell changes things, and it changes them enough that I think it's worth reconsidering the claims about summoning. See, in the Dark Souls series, summons are primarily other players and special quest-related NPCs. It's far easier to dismiss these systems, as summoning other players requires connecting to online multiplayer, and summoning helper NPCs requires certain criteria to be met. Both systems are already somewhat out of the way, and as a result, FromSoft balances each encounter with the assumption that players may not have access to these tools, so it's easier to go through the game without ever utilizing either. But Elden Ring simply hands the player the summoning bell and allows them to access it throughout most of the game. It ties summoning to an FP cost, making it similar to spells or other combat abilities that cost resources. The player will pick up a variety of summons across their playthrough, encouraging them to experiment with different kinds of summons for different encounters, and summons can even be upgraded by a dedicated NPC vendor using specialized upgrade materials, making them similar to weapons in the sense that they are an intended part of your character's progression. These elements all grant a new sense of validity to summoning, but these wouldn't be too big of a problem on their own if it weren't for how the summoning system affects encounter design. Gank bosses are now far more common than in previous games. Fighting these bosses without any help is a nightmare. There are some subtle systems in place to make enemy AI less aggressive when they outnumber the player, but Elden Ring's combat is still ultimately not designed to allow the player to handle multiple enemies at once easily, and it's certainly not designed for encounters against multiple enemies to be fun. It's not impossible to beat these bosses alone, but using the summoning bell makes them much more bearable. Elden Ring is also the first game to so tightly control when and where summons can be accessed. If the player is standing in a summonable area, usually indicating that the area is more challenging, then they can simply summon at will, as opposed to other games where summoning is much more unreliable due to its connection to multiplayer functionality. This means that encounters can be designed around summoning to be much more challenging. However, if a player is determined not to use summons, this may result in some awkwardly balanced encounters. But why would a player be against using summons in the first place? Let's examine the claim that defeating a boss with summons isn't a real victory. At its simplest, the melee combat of the Souls genre goes like this. The boss attacks the player does their best to avoid damage by dodging, blocking, or some other method, and then the player moves in to deal as much damage as they possibly can in the period where the boss is recovering from its offense. If the player dodges at the wrong time or in the wrong direction, fails to recognize the boss's current attack pattern, gets too greedy while dealing damage, runs out of stamina, or makes some other mistake, they will be punished by the boss. 2 or 3 mistakes in a row or one really big mistake can put the player in danger of death, and the game then becomes a question of when it is safe to heal and whether the player can manage to pull it off while getting back into the fight. If the player messes up or they run out of healing because they failed too many times, it's game over. With this system, the player is punished for their mistakes and rewarded for playing well. Over time, the player will play more and more consistently and make fewer mistakes, eventually culminating in triumph over the boss. A triumph that can be directly attributed to the player's own growth. But with summons, things become a bit hazier. Sure, the summon can do a fair amount of damage for the player, which will make the boss objectively easier, but the main problem is that sometimes, seemingly at random, the player will not be punished for their mistakes and will instead be rewarded with an opening to attack whenever the boss AI happens to aggro on the summon. The main problem isn't that the fight is easier, it's that it's inconsistent, and no longer requires that the player fully learn the boss's attack patterns, instead only requiring that the player get lucky at the right time and avoid having to actually deal with the boss's attacks. So is defeating a boss with summons a real victory? Sure. I don't think we should discount or invalidate players' achievements just because they want a different experience, but we should understand that it is just that, a different kind of experience, one that is more enjoyable with friends, one that is somewhat easier, and one that relies less heavily on memorizing boss attack patterns. That type of experience is absolutely valid, and I'm glad it exists for those who want it, but it isn't the type of experience that draws me to FromSoft games, and I don't want summoning to get in the way of the type of experience that I'm here for personally. The response to this argument may be that you still don't have to use summons if you don't want to, and while that is technically true, FromSoft seem to know that attack patterns are easy to interrupt with summons, so they've designed many of the attack patterns in the game to be either extraordinarily long, high damaging, or fast to compensate, meaning that even in non-group boss fights, the design of the bosses still pushes you towards using summons in order to have an appropriate level of challenge. But again, even if the level of challenge is appropriate, it's still harder to feel a sense of growth and accomplishment upon beating the boss, rather than simply feeling, well, that was pretty lucky. Sometimes, though, the challenge isn't at the right level after using summons. Instead, the summons completely trivialize an otherwise difficult boss, so you may accidentally ruin your own experience by obliterating a boss without even putting in much effort, feeling no sense of victory or triumph. But summons are only a single aspect of Elden Ring's expanded combat systems. Perhaps the biggest and most exciting element of Elden Ring's combat is the variety and flexibility of player builds. There are more possible builds than ever before, and many different combinations of weapons, armor, spells, incantations, and talismans can be combined for untold limitless potential. But this makes the game incredibly hard to balance. A boss that is designed to play well with a dexterous samurai may be too fast for a bulky tank to keep up with, or a boss with high physical resistance may be a challenge for melee classes but get completely annihilated by magic users. And even these examples are quite simple, as there are a wide variety of more complex builds and combinations that FromSoft could not have possibly anticipated or balanced specifically around, so some players may have an extremely inconsistent experience, with some bosses being incredibly challenging and others being a cakewalk. A far bigger problem, however, is that some builds generally do well in most scenarios, while some do poorly in almost every scenario. And I think this is why there has been such a rift between players when discussing their experiences of the game. Some players had a build that generally did well throughout the entirety of the game, while others chose a playstyle that could be frustrating or inconsistent, leading to some players believing that bosses were unfair or overpowered, while others felt like people were whining over non-existent problems because their playthrough went just fine. I started my first playthrough as a big booty beefcake, and I struggled to keep up with the insanely fast movesets of many of the bosses, and I'm not the only one who suffered from this problem. I eventually switched to an arcane samurai with the Moonveil katana, and later to a blood build with the Rivers of Blood, both of which were a marked improvement over my beefcake guts cosplay. However, after carefully crafting my build to be able to deal with the challenges that Elden Ring presents, I came across a new problem. I was completely overpowered. Well, not completely. It's more that the bosses had become incredibly volatile. Either I walk into the boss fight and get destroyed in a single combo because the boss's damage scaling is absolutely off the charts, or I manage to chain blood loss on them enough times for them to explode before they ever use any of their most dangerous attack combinations. The game had simply become a test of who could be more overpowered, which robs the game of its depth and de-emphasizes player skill. The counter-argument may be that it's my fault that my build is overpowered, that maybe I spent too much time grinding or exploring side areas and got over-leveled, or that I should tweak my build or switch to a different one if I'm not having fun. A common defense of the fact that the Souls games have no difficulty settings is that players can choose their own difficulty through the way that they play. Different builds, items, and strategies will all provide different levels of challenge, and with the right knowledge, you can adjust the difficulty of the game to your liking. The main problem with this argument is that Elden Ring is obtuse, and as a result, extraordinarily bad at teaching the player which knobs they need to turn in order to push the difficulty in the right direction. There's no way new players are going to know how to choose the right difficulty for themselves, partially owing to the fact that they don't yet even know what level of challenge would be best for them, but also owing to the fact that even if they did somehow know the exact experience that they wanted going into the game, they would have no idea what to do in order to get it to that level of challenge without making extensive use of online guides. It's telling that I, 70 hours in and with the help of many YouTube videos and hours of wiki research, was still struggling to craft an experience for myself that could rival my experiences with the previous Souls games, and it was during this struggle that I came to a sudden realization: I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to spend hours crafting 5 different builds just to find one that is actually enjoyable. I don't want to second guess myself every time I simply use the mechanics that the game hands to me, like summoning. I don't want to defeat a boss and feel like it's my fault that it wasn't satisfying. I don't want to constantly have to readjust how I play, nerfing myself if I'm too strong or grinding if I'm too weak. I don't want to balance FromSoft's game for them, because simply put, that shouldn't be my responsibility. Yes, there is something to be said for having optional ways to push yourself, extra challenges, or a little bit of flexibility when it comes to difficulty level. But if a player doesn't enjoy their experience with the game, the blame should rarely, if ever, be placed on them. Take a game like Celeste. Celeste is one of the hardest games I've ever played, harder than any FromSoft game, at least in some levels. And yet it does an incredible job of onboarding players and teaching them the mechanics in an encouraging way, to the point where there are many casual gamers who have beaten the game and even continued on to beat many of the more challenging B-sides and other post-game content. The game has an assist mode, but aside from that it only has one official difficulty setting, similar to FromSoft games. So why then, when a game like Celeste exists, a game that is perfectly tuned by the developers to be a satisfying and accessible experience for many different players, does Elden Ring require that the player balance the game for themselves? It's not because FromSoft can't balance a game. Sekiro, Bloodborne, and even the fairly flexible combat systems of Dark Souls are all well balanced enough in varying degrees. But Elden Ring is far too big and far too open for FromSoft to effectively balance the wealth of encounters and playstyles. My playtime for the first playthrough of Elden Ring is approximately 70 hours, twice as long as it took me to beat previous FromSoft games, and Elden Ring did not have a significantly longer development cycle than its siblings. The developers simply did not have the time or resources to fully balance and tweak every single playstyle, and we've seen a couple of post-launch patches in an attempt to remedy this. But the greatest way to ensure your game is balanced is to make the systems flexible enough for players to balance the game themselves. The only problem is that this places an incredible burden on the player. By this point, I've talked quite a bit about the problems that Elden Ring's emphasis on player expression and exploration causes for its combat, and in some reviews I have seen the claim that the caveat to the game's flawed combat is that it has some of the best exploration in gaming, and unfortunately I must disagree. Not only does the increased focus on open design elements in Elden Ring cause many problems for the narrow design that we are used to from FromSoft, but the narrow design elements obstruct the open ones as well. As in the previous games, in Elden Ring, FromSoft aims to give the player a sense of growth over the course of the game. To accomplish this, the player must conquer progressively harder challenges, but it's difficult to provide this linear sense of progression in a non-linear open world, so to mitigate this issue, Elden Ring is divided up into several different zones that each have a soft level requirement. As long as the player is strong enough for a given zone, they should be able to explore the zone non-linearly and at their leisure. Each zone is theoretically open, but the overarching world isn't really as open as it seems. I say theoretically because the zones themselves aren't always as open as they seem either. When I first journeyed past Stormvale Castle and into Liurnia of the Lakes, I looked off to my right and thought, oh, that seems interesting. First I'll explore down that road and see how far I can get around the perimeter of the swamp. But when I went to explore the path that I had chosen, I discovered I could not get down safely. Torrent is a great steed, better than most video game horses, and as a result the traversal of Elden Ring is more flexible than something like The Witcher or Skyrim. But despite this flexibility, there are still many deadly drops, unscalable cliffs, and uncrossable gaps, and so with no other path to take, I was forced down into the swamp. Also in this area is a plateau, which seemed very interesting to me, and I spent a long time trying to figure out how to get up to it, only to discover that after finally looking it up, it could only be accessed as a part of an NPC questline, which ended up taking me a very roundabout way underground, eventually emerging on top of the plateau. There is quite an enticing promise that is inherent in the concept of the open world. You see that? You can go there. And this is a powerful promise of uninhibited exploration, a promise that Elden Ring does not deliver on, at least not immediately. Look at this vista, for example. There is a lot of verticality in the lands between, which makes it easy to spot several different interesting locations. Elden Ring's world is clearly designed to be admired and examined, but as soon as we decide we want to head in a particular direction, we run into a problem. Because traversal is too limited for such a vertically structured world, there is no clear path forward to any of these points of interest, and it's unclear if any of them are even accessible from the direction we are approaching them. As a result, as I progressed through the game, I began to see these beautiful vistas as set dressing rather than locations to discover, and more distant regions began to fade out of focus, leaving me with basically just my immediate surroundings. To be clear, Elden Ring does technically fulfill the promise that if you see something in the distance, you can go there at some point, but it feels a bit disappointing to see something and rather than going straight there, just having to hope you stumble upon it at some point down the line. Brom's Band-Aid solution to this is a very detailed world map. The map is unlike some open world game maps in that it isn't full of icons telling you exactly what to do and where to go, but it's honestly pretty close. It is extremely easy to scan the map, mark a few obvious points of interest such as ruins, caves, everjails, or other large structures, and make your way over, regularly checking your map to figure out which route you need to take. This meant that rather than scanning the horizon for points of interest or just getting lost in exploring the world, it was far more efficient to make a beeline for the area's map fragment, mark all the important content on my map, and systematically check it off my list. This ends up robbing the player of any real sense of discovery and alienating them from the actual environment, making it feel like I'm exploring the map rather than exploring the world. And this is just one of a few ways that Elden Ring fails to encourage and even punishes exploration. Another example is the game's corpse run mechanic, a staple of all of FromSoft's games. This is a holdover from classic MMOs where upon death the player must return to their corpse to pick up their loot or risk losing it. This raises the stakes of player death because it means players could lose their valuable currency that's used to purchase items and level up, and it encourages them to continually repeat encounters until they succeed and are able to reclaim their souls, or runes, for good. It is a fantastic mechanic that establishes the tone of the game by giving harsh consequences to death, while also pushing the player forward and rewarding player growth and triumph over their previous failures. The one caveat to this is that it discourages exploration, which is obviously a big problem for a game that has an increased emphasis on just that. If the player dies in a boss fight or some difficult encounter, they may realize that the encounter is too challenging for their current level, and then must decide between giving up all their runes to explore elsewhere until they're strong enough for the encounter, or beating their head against a challenge that they aren't ready for until they eventually manage to come out on top. A common defense of some of the bosses, one in particular, being too challenging is that it's meant to encourage players to explore in other directions in order to become more powerful. It's meant to teach the player that difficult encounters or regions can be conquered by exploring and grinding other areas of the map and coming back later. I have no problem with this concept in theory, but the game's corpse run mechanic stands in direct opposition to this idea, as in order to explore in other directions to become more powerful, they have to give up the very resource that they used to gain strength in the first place. And if players decide they do want to beat their head against the wall, they may come away from the encounter learning the opposite lesson, that any encounter can be brute forced with enough time and dedication, which is technically true, but the player may have a miserable time if that's how they approach the rest of the game. Another way Elden Ring fails to reward exploration is through its variety of loot and weapons. Because of the vast variety of builds available in the game, there are mountains of items hidden away in the world that can be used in different builds. However, which of these items are useful to a given player depends entirely on their build, and since any given build will only be able to utilize a tiny fraction of all the items in the game, a vast majority of the treasure you find on your journey will be completely useless. Breath of the Wild is widely regarded as having some of the best exploration in video games, and while the game is not without its flaws, it always rewards exploration, and the rewards are almost always something useful, whether it be a spirit orb, a weapon that the player can actually use, armor piece, or crafting material. In Outer Wilds, there is only one reward for exploration: knowledge. But knowledge is always useful and exciting in that game as it's the basis for how the progression of the game is structured. But in Elden Ring, if you are playing an Unga Bunga Big Stick Man and you find one of the many spells in the game, an Ash of War or talisman that isn't applicable to your build, which will likely be most of them, a wizard staff, a samurai sword, or anything out of the ocean of weapons that are unusable to you, then the best you can do is sell it, except you may not want to sell it because who knows whether your Unga Bunga build will be viable in the late game. Part of this problem is that Elden Ring simply has too many weapons. The game has 31 weapon categories, and with each category containing several weapons, the weapon total is at a whopping 377. But because there are so many, the developers likely didn't have time or resources to make each one unique. So there are many weapons in the game that are functionally identical with slight variations, and some weapons are just objectively worse versions of others. As a result, even if the player manages to find a weapon that's technically usable for their build, it may still be one of the several redundant weapons, so many of the items found as rewards end up being useless and sit in your inventory for much of the game. There also came a point with my build where I stopped really needing new items. I knew I had the best weapon in the game for my build, didn't need new armor, had good talismans, I was pretty much set. So the promise of treasure no longer mattered that much to me, and I no longer felt compelled to explore in search of new loot. Plus, if there's an item you really need, it's far simpler to look up where to find it rather than explore in every direction and hope you stumble upon it. The problem of the overabundance of useless loot is caused in part by the fact that the world is simply too massive. They need all of these weapons and other loot in order to fill the world with rewards for exploration, and the problems with having such a gargantuan world don't stop there, because such a large overworld requires not only treasure to uncover, but also things to do and interesting environments to do them in, and as a result, Elden Ring is full of copy-pasted and recycled content. To compare once again to Breath of the Wild, that game has 120 shrines, all of which are visually identical, but aside from the 20 test of strength shrines, each is a unique challenge. When the player encounters a shrine, it's an exciting discovery, as each puzzle or collection of puzzles is generally entirely novel and allows the player to utilize the flexible mechanics of the game in ways that they hadn't thought of before. Elden Ring has catacombs, and aside from a unique surprise or trap here and there, they're all entirely generic. When the player enters one, they know exactly what they're in for. Just fight through rooms of skeletons or imps until finding a switch, then go beat the same boss they've seen 3 or 4 times already. It also has ruins, which are also fairly generic. Whenever I found a ruin, I would simply run around on torrent until I found a stairway to a basement that usually housed some sort of treasure. There are also various wizard towers, and these could sometimes have a unique puzzle attached, but usually it was just find 3 glowing blue things, and the more unique ones could be so obtuse that a vast majority of players will need to look up the answer anyway. I could go on about the recycled churches, caves, everjails, and ruined towers, and I could talk at length about how the constant repetition of boss encounters across the game cheapens what might otherwise be memorable experiences. The first dragon was cool, the second was disappointing, and the 5th was tedious, but rather than over-explain all of that, let me get to the point. I don't mean to say that FromSoft are bad, lazy designers that copy-paste content because they can't think of original ideas, but that FromSoft's signature gameplay and combat systems simply don't lend themselves well to this type of copy-pasting and quickly become monotonous. FromSoft games require interesting level and enemy design in order to spice up their combat, which, while it can be very rewarding, doesn't evolve or change much over the course of the game, and gets most of its variety from how players use a few simple tools to respond to various, sometimes complex, enemies. For proof of this concept, look no further than Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons, procedurally generated infinite dungeons that were almost universally derided as tedious primarily due to their lack of handcrafted levels and constantly recycled enemies. I can't imagine I'm the only one that feels like Elden Ring's catacombs and ruins feel reminiscent of the Chalice dungeons, and I would not be surprised if some level of procedural generation was used in the development of Elden Ring in order to expedite the creation of the various catacombs, though that is purely conjecture. I can't help but feel like it didn't need to be this way. From could have made a 40-hour game that's filled to the brim with unique content rather than a colossal 80-hour experience that feels repetitive, and it's painful to think about just how much interesting and exciting stuff we could have gotten if From didn't spend so much development time trying to fill an oversized world. For example, I understand that towns and villages were a planned feature of Elden Ring but were scrapped due to scope constraints, and the fact that the lands between are barren of any kind of friendly or even neutral society is a big problem for the game, because perhaps the biggest discouragement of exploration is just how desolate the world is. There is no joy, no civilization, no love, no comfort in this world. Though the player's mission and sole reason for existence is to rebuild the fractured world, the question remains who they are building it for. And it's a question I cannot answer, because there is almost nothing left that resembles a society here. Nothing and no one to fight for. This wasn't really a problem in previous games due to their linear nature. It was easy to imagine that there were people. There was life worth protecting, just not here. I could pretend that I was journeying into the most dangerous places to save lands elsewhere that had something worth preserving, and those games were only 40 hours long. In a game almost double the length, the pain begins to drag on. As a point of reference, Breath of the Wild also takes place after some world-shattering calamity. In this world, Ganon has won, the world is broken, and yet there are still some settlements. Although they are small and beset by monsters or other problems, they offer a bit of hope for Link's quest and show the player exactly what they are fighting to preserve. Each new discovery is met with excitement, yet apprehension, as the player may be met with danger, but also with kindness, beauty, and wonder. I remember stumbling upon Farosh for the first time, and thinking that it was some terrifying boss that I would have to defeat. But upon approaching, I found that while it was powerful and dangerous, it was not malicious. I glided next to it in wonder of what exactly it was. It could be a god of sorts, or just an incredibly powerful monster or demon, but regardless of its lore, to me it represented and was a part of the natural world. Beautiful, awe-inspiring, dangerous, indifferent. There are other encounters like this in the world. The other dragons and the Lord of the Mountain come to mind. But it's also filled with smaller, fun surprises, the Koroks, various unique overworld shrine puzzles, memorable NPC encounters, mini-games. All of these serve to drive the player towards exploration, to make them excited for what might be around the corner, even if sometimes it could be death. The narratives of FromSoft games, unlike Breath of the Wild, have never been simple save-the-world stories. They've always been more tragic and twisted, more complex, dreamlike in some ways, or perhaps more like a nightmare. But there are also games that try to push the player onward, to be the little voice in the back of your head that says, you can do it. And I think motivating the player to keep pushing forward is an important part of Souls games, or at least your journey shouldn't feel pointless. When the world is dark and despair surrounds you, there is a faint shimmer of hope that maybe things can be better. In Elden Ring, that shimmer of hope is gone. The overworld contains the entirety of the lands between, and when it comes to friendly faces, it is almost completely barren. What's more, every questline ends in the death of what few friends you may make, so even if the Elden Ring is reforged and the world is saved, there will be no one left to appreciate it aside from the mad and depraved. Elden Ring has a lot to do with tragedy, and to its credit, perhaps I haven't been entirely fair. Bloodborne is certainly darker than Elden Ring in both its tone and themes, and I understand that for how many hours you find a tragic and depressing experience to be palatable ultimately comes down to personal preference. But while part of why this works in Bloodborne is the fact that it's what you'd expect out of an Eldritch horror game, the main reason why such a dark tone works for me there and not in Elden Ring is that Bloodborne is linear, because the real problem is not necessarily that Elden Ring is too dark or sad, but that its world is not inviting to explore. In Bloodborne, the world is grim, horrific, grotesque. The player's journey through it is a cautious and fearful one, where the player ventures down each dark hall with trepidation. This isn't a world that you are meant to explore or conquer, but a twisted maze that you must escape. You are meant to see something disgusting and dread what might happen if you get too close. To feel like each safe haven or marker of progress is a brief respite from the nightmare, out of danger, but only for a moment. In Elden Ring, I found myself experiencing similar feelings. Though in my first 40 or so hours of the game, I still had the energy and drive to explore the world and venture into danger just to see what was at its heart. Once I realized that the answer was usually just something useless, sad, or more danger, I lost all motivation. When I spotted something that looked interesting, I felt confident that it would probably try to kill me, or at least just be kind of depressing. So rather than seeking out adventure and trying to explore every nook and cranny or allowing myself to get lost in the world, I generally avoided danger and focused on getting to whatever my current objective may be. By my 60th hour of death and misery, I was ready for it to be over. The darkness was overwhelming. All of this is to say that in the latter half of my playthrough, the world began to shrink, from something to be explored to something to be survived. When I would see something that triggered the curious part of my brain and made me think, what's over there? I would think about whether it's even possible for me to get there right now, whether there would be any useful reward, whether I would discover anything that brought me joy, or whether it would just be another unscalable wall, useless item, generic catacomb, or monster waiting to kill me. By now, some of you may be screaming at your screen that not every game's exploration has to be like Breath of the Wild, that much of this is intentional, that no game's world is fully open, not even Breath of the Wild, and that the goals of Elden Ring's exploration are different, that Elden Ring is meant to evoke not a sense of wonder and curiosity, but of caution and danger at every corner, that it's meant to be a vast, treacherous world filled with monsters, and it's the player's job to forge a path through it, that its tone should be dour and should never hold as much light and happiness as a Zelda game. And I completely agree. But FromSoft games have always had exploration in them, even in their more linear iterations, and I believe that format is a far more effective method of eliciting those types of feelings than an open world is. It seems to me like placing this game in an open world has caused a tremendous amount of problems for the game and ballooned the scope to unmaintainable levels while offering very limited improvement in exploration over previous games, in some ways making the exploration more generic and dull. In Dark Souls 3, while the player may not be able to look off in the distance, see something interesting and go directly there, the trade-off is that every nook and cranny may hold some secret, be it treasure, monster, or a secret passage to a new area. Elden Ring attempts to deliver on this idea as well, and sometimes is very successful, but due to the smaller scope of Dark Souls, each new discovery in that game is handcrafted rather than recycled, and we've already discussed how Elden Ring doesn't really deliver on the you can go there concept very well. So while it might initially seem like Elden Ring is pushing the Souls genre forward when it comes to exploration, I think the exploration of previous titles accomplishes the player experience goals of the series far better and causes far fewer problems for combat and progression. The developers at From Software have always been uncompromising in their dedication to a core set of design elements. Intensely challenging but rewarding combat, harsh consequences, immersive world building, overwhelmingly hostile worlds, vague storytelling, a general affinity for the obscure. It's a combination of these elements and more that have given rise to an entirely new genre, the Souls-like. But it's this very unwillingness to compromise that has led to the game's most dire problems. Elden Ring is a game that wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be the most vast, open experience gaming has ever seen, while still structuring the progression of the player and world linearly. It wants the player to feel afraid of the consequences of death, while also encouraging the player to explore freely. It wants to support various distinct builds and playstyles, while allowing each build to feel satisfying and rewarding throughout an 80-hour playthrough and against many different bosses and encounters. These contradictions were present, though less extreme, in the Dark Souls series, and while those games did suffer for it, they can be forgiven, as Dark Souls 1 was still pioneering its own style, and many of the problems of Dark Souls 2 and 3 were simply continuations of the ones introduced in 1. But it's frustrating to see Elden Ring repeat the mistakes of Souls past, primarily because many of them were fixed in Sekiro and Bloodborne. Sekiro removes summoning entirely, which does potentially make the learning curve of the game steeper, but it also makes it more consistent, and Bloodborne may not be as extreme in its streamlining of possible playstyles as Sekiro, with just the single katana and a handful of combat arts, but even it almost completely eliminates ranged combat and homogenizes the different classes and builds to an extent, which simplifies balancing considerably. Additionally, trick weapons take the weapon count from Elden Ring's staggering 377 down to just 26. Some may disagree, but I much prefer a smaller pool of weapons that each have expanded movesets and feel more distinct from their siblings. Despite Bloodborne maintaining 24 different weapons, it manages to make all of them feel satisfying and consistent across a playthrough, as even the heavier weapons like the Kirk Hammer are significantly faster than the heavy weapons in Elden Ring, even when ignoring their faster second forms. This means that regardless of whether a weapon uses strength or skill, their playstyles are similar enough that the bosses can be easily balanced in a way that accounts for all of them. Despite all my criticisms, I see the merit in Elden Ring, and I don't think it's a bad game. The scope of its world and breadth of its gameplay systems are genuinely impressive, head and shoulders above what Ubisoft's open world machine spits out. The game does have a few surprises and exciting discoveries, the legacy dungeons hold up very well, combat problems aside. It's the most enjoyable FromSoft game to play with friends, plus it's one of the most artistically gorgeous games I've ever played. But while Elden Ring pushes the Souls-like genre forward in some regards, it also marks a return to the problems that plagued the series at its inception and had since been solved. It has brought From Software from tight, focused combat that has been refined over the course of multiple titles back to inconsistent combat and redundant weapons, and introduces some new problems as well, such as its lackluster exploration, broader, more generic locales, and exhausting storytelling. I won't dispute that Elden Ring introduces some new and exciting concepts for the genre, I just think they came at too heavy a price. So while exploring the lands between is like walking through a painting, I can't help but feel like I'm walking backwards.